From the KIRO Radio Newsroom in Seattle, I'm Dave Ross, and these are the Ross Files. One of the biggest debates we have is the role of social media in politics and actually in many things. And one person who has made a career in this is Kate Starbird, who is you're an associate professor now at the UW, right?
The promotion has happened to associate professor, but the title doesn't confer for another couple of weeks.
Okay. Well, anyway, that's great. When I first saw this news release, I said, she plays basketball because you were part of the old Seattle Reign. And I distinctly remember bringing my daughters to see a game and seeing them marvel at women playing basketball at a professional level. So you made quite an impact then, and I'm going to ask you later on about how you made the transition from basketball to research. But first, let's talk about this area of study. When you talk about the role of social media in a crisis, and the positive and the negative, how has it changed from the days when people would, say, call each other on the phone or just share something over the back fence?
Yeah, I think the social media opens up a lot of different kinds of conversations where you're not just talking to one person, you're not just one person broadcasting to a large number of people, but there's a back and forth between individuals, between different kinds of audiences, where individuals can actually share information with media officials, as well as other people in their neighborhood or people halfway across the world. And so what happens after crisis events is a lot of people converge digitally onto the event to see what's going on, to share information. And we've actually seen a lot of cases where people converge and start helping each other, trying to help people get information, start organizing volunteer efforts. There's actually been some really sort of pro-social activity that we'd see on social media after crisis events. More recently, we've become interested in the sharing of rumors and the spread of misinformation. And then even more recently, in the last few years, we've begun to focus on the intentional spread of disinformation around crisis events and other kinds of breaking news.
So explain me the difference between disinformation and misinformation.
Yeah, so actually the crisis context is a great one to think about this. After a crisis event, there's a lot of anxiety and uncertainty, and people are just trying to figure things out. And actually spreading rumors and trying to understand and coming up with explanations is kind of a natural part of the aftermath of crisis events. And we might not even want to problematize that because it's really important for people they don't have perfect information and they're trying to get the best information they have. And sometimes it turns out to be wrong. So rumors are actually unintentional misinformation. But when you talk about disinformation is intentional. And there's a certain kind of disinformation that we're seeing in our space that has a certain kind of strategic intent of manipulating how people think about world events, manipulating political outcomes, and actually just undermining trust in information spaces.
So we're talking about then the Russian manipulation of our election process in part, or are we talking about other things too?
That is an example of disinformation, but disinformation can be used by domestic actors. It can be used by your own government against you. And it can be, Russia is not the only perpetrator of disinformation in the information spaces that we study.
So give me an example of some of the motives behind disinformation. What is the disinformer trying to accomplish?
Well, there's a couple of different things. I mean, to take your example, which is one we've studied a lot of, Russian disinformation, the motives are they're multidimensional on a short-term scale and a long-term scale. In the short term, to be disinformed is to believe a false narrative. But in the long term, what happens is that disinformation erodes our trust in information. It sows doubt. It makes us confused about whether or not we can trust something, whether or not we can trust information. It also begins to sow division in society, so it amplifies differences. And one of the theoretical perspectives we're working right now on how Russian disinformation works and what its purposes are really to sort of undermine our common ground, where we can't come together to agree on what is actually happening, we don't have a shared understanding, right. And therefore we can't actually govern as a democratic society.
Everybody has their own facts, right?
Yeah.
But the way to handle that, of course, is the branding of certain sources as being reliable. So a story that you read in the New York Times or the Washington Post is going to be more credible than something that was shared on Facebook from a site you never heard of, right?
I agree that it's easy for some of us to think that way, but I think a lot of people assign different kinds of reliability to different sources, and especially in the modern information space where you can really get any source. There's all sorts of possibilities of what kind of information is out there. And a lot of times people tend to seek out things that already aligns with what they believe. Mm-hmm. And then when we do that, we become really vulnerable to disinformation because we're seeking things that are what we want to believe rather than what is actually true.
Yes, but doesn't that ever come to the point where you realize that's what you're doing to yourself and that you, in fact, that you are making yourself more vulnerable? I mean, usually people don't want to be considered vulnerable. They want to be considered smart and in control of things.
Yeah, they do. And most people that we talk to, even people that I'm watching share disinformation, will say that they're not the suckers, that someone else is the one that believes disinformation.
Even though you're seeing them behaving like suckers.
Absolutely. And to turn that back around, our own researchers, when we start studying disinformation, it can be so compelling. When we've studied disinformation that's targeted towards people like us, so I have a research team, a lot of left-leaning individuals, and some of them are from international countries, so they're they resonate with some far-left kinds of narratives. I've seen my research team fall victim to some of the disinformation targeting the far left.
Like what?
When we were studying the white helmets in the campaign against the white helmets in Syria, the white helmets, if you don't know a lot about it, the white helmets have been targeted for years by a disinformation campaign from Russia to kind of undermine
And who are
their
they?
work. The white helmets are a humanitarian response organization that works in rebel-held areas of Syria. So they're in the areas that were sort of standing up against Assad.
Okay.
And they were targeted, they were undermined, and it was a very effective campaign. You can actually see people on the left in the U.S. who believe this propaganda campaign against the white helmets and will amplify it and share things about it. And when my students first went in to study this, it took them about 2 months to actually, they went in, they're like, oh, this stuff actually looks pretty real. Are you sure that the white helmets are a humanitarian response organization? Because this content is really compelling. And then it took us, months to sort of map out how that information was reaching them and how people were sharing it and how it was manipulating them before the students kind of recognized, oh, I was being manipulated. And I was, even as disinformation researchers, we're vulnerable.
Wow. Did that surprise them?
It surprised them. It surprised me, especially some of the more senior students. And actually, it was more effective on the more senior students who were like PhD students who have seen more of the world and have read more and have.
That's really disturbing because you would like to think that education would inoculate you against being taken by one of these things.
Yeah, one of the most troubling things we see is actually that disinformation uses the rhetoric of critical thinking to actually try to break down everything, to create doubt about everything, to sort of to break down reality. And so they'll take critical thinking into this sort of nihilistic skepticism, where you stop trusting anything. And that's, in critical thinking, I mean, it's really important for how we understand media, but it can be sort of co-opted in these.
So teaching critical thinking skills isn't enough because those are the very skills that these people are the misinformers are manipulating.
Yeah, we need to be aware of how that sort of rhetoric of critical thinking is being used to sort of take.
Well, then what do you do? Then there's no hope.
I mean, I think that I like to believe there's hope. I mean, we're working on the problem, but it definitely is more complex. There's not easy solutions. I think it's going to take a lot of. I think it's going to take solutions from multiple different directions. We're going to have to look at how technology might work differently. We're going to have to build up journalism to make it more trustworthy. We're going to have education solutions.
The only rule of thumb I've been able to figure out is because as somebody who's on the air doing news broadcasts all day, I'm always looking for the most interesting story, right?
Right.
And now I've come to think that the moment I see a story that is really interesting and I really want to do, that's when to watch out. Because somebody is probably thinking the very same thing I am. I've got 5 minutes to fill, and I want to be the most interesting stuff. And if something's too interesting, that's when I have to get it from like 3 or 4 different places before running with it.
Absolutely. I think I think we're all kind of becoming more savvy about that. I remember, not too many months ago, seeing the first images of the Notre Dame Cathedral on fire in France, and I didn't believe it at first. I thought, those have to be fake images because I'm just so trained now to doubt, to doubt what I'm seeing because I know that, we have synthetic media, synthetic images, we can create all sorts of images of different things. And so I think there's a value to being skeptical, but there's also a danger of being too skeptical. And so we have to learn whom to trust again and learn how to trust and also have sort of a sense of like, how do we build more trustworthy media systems and information systems?
So how is your research being used, and who is it intended for? Has Facebook shown an interest? Have Google, the other aggregators, shown an interest in using this to help us out a little bit?
We have a lot of interesting conversations with people. The social media companies in the last couple of years, I think we can all sort of be critical of them moving too slowly and allowing these problems to proliferate and sort of abdicating some of the responsibility early on. But I have had great conversations. I have seen them at interesting tables. They're showing up at conferences, and they understand the complexity of the problem. And they are in conversation with researchers like me and my team. And we're not the only ones. They're talking to a lot of different people. And so it's sort of an all hands on deck type of thing. And there's different researchers from different fields working, and the technology companies are trying to be part of those conversations because I think they realize this is a really complex problem and they're not going to be able to solve it on their own.
Who has a good model? Does Wikipedia have a good model?
I mean, each social media platform affords different things or allows different things depending on their features. Wikipedia has a great model for what it does. It has some limitations. There are some certain kinds
Can you
of
trust
biases.
it? I mean, I go to Wikipedia a lot, quite frankly, and I've come to trust it because, even to the point that I donate to it on a regular basis, because there seem to be dedicated people who, the moment somebody tries to take over a significant Wikipedia page and fill it with propaganda, they're immediately called out.
Yeah, so they have great moderation policies and sort of procedures and practices there at Wikipedia that kind of enable the people that are there curating to try to keep not a neutral. I mean, neutral is the wrong word, but to keep a trustworthy platform where we're getting at sort of multiple viewpoints, factual viewpoints, but also getting not false balance, right? So they're actually getting towards the truth of things. There are some weaknesses and vulnerabilities with Wikipedia as well. We're not seeing that in English language Wikipedia. We're not seeing that on sort of U.S.-based topics. But there are certain sub-communities of Wikipedia based on language where a certain political group has taken over, where they have all their
I could see that,
where they have all their people as the moderators, and they're able to kind of like push their kind of view and curate everything and edit everything to fit their view. I think the way it developed in the U.S., they already had all this infrastructure before the information operations started, and so for English-based Wikipedia, I think it's a really strong. I think it's a really high-quality source of information. I'm kind of wary on breaking news events because it takes a while for them to settle.
Yes,
and then also sort of niche topics can be overtaken by a group of people that are motivated to do it. But in the long term, those usually get edited out.
Should unvetted live video be allowed?
That's a little bit outside of my. I mean, be allowed by whom?
By anybody. I mean, the government would have to step in. But as a broadcaster, we are subject to government regulation.
Right.
We have to put everything we do is on a delay now, just to be safe for some reason. I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's what we do. And we're held responsible for what goes out over the air. The people who are employed here, if they were to make up something, would be fired. So Facebook is a broadcaster with basically no editing, where anybody can hijack the transmitter and broadcast anything they want almost anonymously, because you can set up phony Facebook accounts, not be held responsible for it, which strikes me as pretty much a crazy way to run a business.
What's their only way that business is going to run? Because they can't.
Well, they could start hiring live editors. Well, I know they can't possibly do it because they've allowed this thing to blossom out of control.
Right. Well, there's no way for them to hire moderators at the scale that the sharing happens, and so their whole sort of content sharing model would be very hard to support.
But there would be ways, right? Because, I mean, if it's being picked, if a broadcast is being picked up by 50 people, fine. But if it's being picked up by 1 million people, you need to have a human being there saying, should this be on the air?
So this is sort of they could moderate based on how widely seen the content is. And once the content is seen by this many people, or once it hits a certain kind of influencer, then they would come through and send it to their moderation or slow it down and make it move more slowly. But you use the example of video content, but would you apply that to images? Would you apply that to text? Where do we draw the line of like what kind of communication do we stop when, and who moderates what? I think there are some interesting conversations to have around sort of audience size or sort of network features. When it hits certain parts of the network, then we need to, because when it hits an influencer, when it hits, somebody who has a big audience, that may be where, the moderation needs to happen.
So are you concerned about threats to democracy in this technology?
Absolutely.
And tell me how that would play out.
I think we're already seeing it play out, where we are losing trust in our democratic society. We are having direct attacks on the election infrastructure, which is going to diminish our trust in it. We're having sort of rhetorical attacks on our election infrastructure where people say, oh, they're cheating or voter fraud or whatever, which undermines our trust in in the results of elections. We're becoming more polarized, which makes it hard to come together to have conversations about how to govern ourselves. And we're losing that kind of shared understanding of what's actually going on because our information space is fragmented. We're all getting information from different places, and it's often information that doesn't align. It's like two totally different views of an event. And then the widely spread conspiracy theories, we don't even have like a common understanding of what's going on. And a society like that is going to have a hard time governing using a democratic model. And I think that's where the sort of pervasive spread of disinformation is really dangerous to a democratic society. And I think we really need to figure out collectively how do we resist that? How do we become more resilient to these attacks? Otherwise, the drift is going to be towards authoritarian models of.
Well, that's the next question, of course, because China has decided to take control of this. They control the internet. They have cameras everywhere, and they nip demonstrations in the bud. Although, from what I hear, it's not covered much, but I hear there have been some huge demonstrations, protest demonstrations in China. We certainly have seen that in Hong Kong now. So, is that really the only way to get control of this, is to move towards some kind of complete government control of the flow of information?
I would not advise that as a way to go. I think there is sort of globally a rise in authoritarian leadership in different places, and I think that our information systems are part of the cause of why authoritarian structures are on the rise, and sort of right-wing populist authoritarian leaders are becoming popular in different places and taking and maintaining power. I'm not sure that's a desirable state, but I do think sort of the Western democratic model is going to have to figure out what to do with these new sort of paradigm of information sharing, and figure out how to shore up our vulnerabilities. I think democratic societies have always been attacked right at our value systems, at freedom of speech.
So are there historical precedents for what we're seeing now?
Well, the tactics of disinformation targeting freedom of speech are longstanding. So there's an old statement about, I can't remember which KGB or Soviet Union leader said this, but it was something about if the U.S. didn't have the free press, we would have to invent it for them, because they've often targeted and tried to use unwitting agents, and those unwitting agents are often members of the press to push out their narratives.
Whereas our own founders felt that free press was fundamental to the security of a democracy.
And it is, right? So it absolutely is, but it's also a vulnerability. So how do we navigate where we kind of allow this sort of flourishing of the sharing of ideas without the intentional manipulation of those? So disinformation isn't about us sharing ideas and trying to figure out which ideas are the best. It's actually trying to just jam the signal so we actually don't even get to the good ideas, because it's so overwhelmed with information that's just supposed to make us doubt what we're seeing, and it's not trying to lead us to being informed. It's trying to lead us to the opposite.
So this is still very much in flux, and as far as you know, there's really no reliable clearinghouse that everybody agrees on where you can go to check whether something you've read is true or false.
Well, we're so divided that if one group went there for their information, another group would say that would be the reason not to go there.
So not even Snopes, huh?
Right. Well, no, unfortunately not. And you can actually see targeted attacks against Snopes that starting a few years ago, where they were trying to undermine people's trust in it.
Yeah. So now what I want to know is, how did you go from being a basketball star with the Seattle Reign and then later the Seattle Storm to becoming basically a genius PhD working on informatics?
Yeah, I guess that's a good question. I'm not sure that the story is all that interesting, but I did, let's see, I'm about 30 years old. I was playing overseas at the time, so I finished my professional career. I played a few years in the WNBA, and then I started playing overseas, and I finished up in Spain, I guess. And I played 3 seasons there. Really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed living overseas, and then I had a computer science degree as an undergrad, but I hadn't
You'd gone to Stanford?
At Stanford, yeah. But I hadn't done anything for 10 years with it.
Really?
Right, not really. I mean, I'd done a little bit here and there, but I was really not fresh. And so I was like, okay, so I'm 10 years out. I don't have any training to do anything. I don't really know how to go to a job because I've been doing this sort of like, 2 hours here, 2 hours there kind of job for years. And I was like, what should I do? Oh, I'll go back to school. And I just got actually lucky. I was had been invited to a luncheon for women in STEM, or actually it was women in ICT or information technology, and they were having a luncheon about how to get more women and girls involved in technical careers. And the person who sat next to me was like, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm going to go back to school. And he was like, well, what are you going to go back to school in? And I'm like, well, I've been thinking anthropology because I'm really interested in people and cultures because I've been living abroad and all these things. And he said, well, didn't you have an undergraduate degree in computer science? I said, oh, yes, but whatever. And he's like, well, there's this whole new field where you can do anthropology and computer science together, where you can look at how people interact, but in digital spaces. And I said, what? There is? And so he's like, yeah, and I have got this program that I've been starting at the University of Colorado, and you should come. And one thing that leads to the next, and I'm at the University of Colorado, and then in a PhD program there, and then my first year, I meet a professor there, Laisha Palin, who was one of the first people doing work on what she ended up naming crisis informatics, which was the study of how information communication technology, social media are used after crisis events. And so she started studying that. I was like, well, I want to work with you because you're really smart. And so then I just ended up as sort of the ground floor of studying the use of social media during crisis events.
And did your experience as a professional basketball player help you in any way?
There is something about the self-motivation and the work ethic that goes into being a good athlete that really helps becoming an academic, especially the ability to motivate yourself to work because there's not always someone sitting over your shoulder telling you what to do. So you have to be able to kind of do it yourself. And the other thing for me was really public speaking. All the practice I'd had public speaking as an athlete really translated well into sort of figuring out how to communicate my ideas when I was an academic, and then being able to stand on the stage to give talks and things was really helpful as a junior academic.
Well, and I think being able to meet deadlines and work under pressure, and when people are either cheering you or booing you, doesn't that help? It creates resilience.
Maybe it has. Yeah, maybe it helps me kind of weed through my comments on my Twitter account and not get too bothered by some of them. But certainly there's things that I'm not aware of how they affected me. But there's no way that I can think of myself having not been a basketball player. So it's so kind of intertwined with who I became, and at the same time, I hardly ever do anything that seems to have a direct connection.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, it really surprised me when I thought this was going to be an interview about basketball, and it says she's a PhD in informatics at the teaching informatics. So I was really stunned, and so I think that's a fascinating story. And so I'm curious about a couple of things then. As a woman in academia, have you encountered any discrimination?
Yes, that's an interesting question, and it's hard. It's going to be a little bit hard for me to answer because I can't speak for all women, and I have, because of who I am, because of my background, because I'm 6'2", because I present in a way that takes up more space than a lot of people, I may not encounter as much gender discrimination as some of my other colleagues. And in fact, my advisor at the University of Colorado pointed that out to me, that that students would defer to me rather than her. I was a foot taller than she was, and I'm taking up.
So maybe it's not gender; it's just height.
Well, I mean, I present a little bit more masculine. I have short hair. My voice is lower, and so I actually may get a little bit of the male privilege that some of my male colleagues get.
I have never heard a woman say that before.
And it's been hard for me to reflect on it, but I have actually now seen it over time in a little bit of action. On top of that, I'm in a department, human-centered design and engineering, that is more than 50% women. Mm-hmm. We're in the College of Engineering, but it's the faculty members, the students are all sort of split about 50-50 in across the different levels of the department. And so I don't feel any gender discrimination there at all.
Yeah.
In fact, I feel it's a very comfortable place to work, and it's a wonderful department.
Do you know Megan Rapinoe?
I do not know her. No, I know Sue, but I don't know.
Sue Bird, yeah. So tell me where you stand on the whole issue of equal pay in women's sports.
I don't have I don't think I have a great I don't think I have a great response for that. I'm not paying attention to those conversations as much as other people are, because I'm so busy doing my own thing here that I'm not kind of up on that. I would say that if there is a place where that argument should be made, it's for the women's soccer, because they're just such a great product right now, and they are getting so much attention. And it's very clear that if you ask anybody in the U.S. to name some soccer players, they're going to be able to name women's soccer players before they're going to be able to name male soccer players. And so it's such a great example of a place where if there isn't equal pay, then that's a problem, and that shows this, like, it's not just the structure of the economic models there. It has to do with the gender discrimination underneath those economic models. But I don't like to get too much into those things. It's just outside of my areas of expertise right now.
But I'm curious, because you're a woman who's had success in two very different areas of life.
Yeah.
And it seems to me the part of the problem is that the women, to me anyway, seem less ruthless. Like when a male athlete isn't being paid enough, he doesn't show up for training camp, right? And he'll make a big deal about it in the media. Now, Megan has certainly done that, but
it's hard to be ruthless when you're constantly reminded that you're basically, as a basketball player, that the league could leave at any time. The league could be pulled out from underneath you at any time.
I see.
You were always feeling sort of back on your heels and disempowered. You can't stand up to the league because you're not making any money. The league doesn't make enough money, and so therefore you don't even have the right to ask for anything more than we're giving you. You're a charity case. These kinds of things. There's literally the kind of the rhetoric that was happening around us. So it's not women are ruthless. I was like, when you said women aren't as ruthless, I was just remembering just being bruised and battered coming out of practice every day.
You'd have a different point of view
absolutely. And actually looking at the product right now in the WNBA, those women are amazing, and ruthless is probably something we can describe many of those players as, because they're strong and they're playing really hard. But they're not they don't have as much economic power. If they sit out a season, they sit out a season.
Yeah.
And there's not, and a lot of that has to do with long-term discrimination against women in society. It has to do with media not covering the women in the same ways. It has to do with things that are going to take generations to change. But you go and you watch one of those soccer games, or you watch a WNBA game nowadays. These are amazing games. They have an amazing product. The WNBA right now is such a high-quality product compared to what it was when I played, even, that there's no reason, besides all these structural things, that those arenas aren't full and that the tickets aren't being sold and that they're not making, maybe not making $25 million, but they should be making 10% of what the men are making, not 1%.
Yeah. Well, the explanation I've heard for that is, I forget don't hold me to the exact quote, but it was something like, a good high school team could defeat a professional women's team, high school men's team is what I mean.
Go watch the games. Go watch the games, and it's not, you enjoy a game because you're watching a competition happen. And the competition is of a certain quality. And then saying, someone else could walk in and play this game, and like that, what does that have to do with getting behind the product that you're seeing, or caring about the team that you care about and cheering them on? We watch sports at all different levels. We go to high school games, we go to college games, we go to all sorts of things. To say because some high school players could come out here and maybe run faster, do something else, they would not be a better game. Certainly, they would not be as good shooting, passing, running, playing the game. It would not be as pretty of a game. I don't know. It's such a disingenuous argument. It's one of those kind of framing things.
Well, it's a different product. I think the thing that what my daughters liked about it was not a team where you had one person being the hot dog all the time. It seemed to be more of a collaborative approach to basketball. Now, maybe that's changed since then.
It may be. I mean, the WNBA is a little different than the ABL, and also kind of the evolution of the women's pro game has happened where when the ABL was there, it was sort of an extension of the women's college game, but now it's become a thing in and of itself. It's a different game. It's not men's pro and it's not women's college. It's something that it's its own kind of product. The athleticism is really high. It's a little bit more one-on-one than the women's college game, but it's not as sort of kind of slow and just, I don't know. For me, it's so much more entertaining than most of the men's pro games. There's a few teams on the men's pro side that I like to watch, but the women's games are really fun these days.
Well, congratulations on your career and the work you're doing, which is basically center stage in the current debate, because there's nothing more fundamental to keeping a country functioning than being able to trust the information that we base our votes on.
I'd be happy to step off the stage. We could fix these problems, and I can go back to obscurity and just teach in some classes. I'd be happy to have our research not be so interesting right now, and I'm hoping that we can collectively kind of make some dents against this problem. And it's going to be challenging, but I think it's really important.
Dr. Kate Starbird. Kate, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Remember that when there's a longer version of the interviews on Seattle's Morning News, you can usually find it right here in the original form, unconstrained by the limitations of a live broadcast. And you can subscribe so that when someone says, "Did you hear what was on Seattle's Morning News?" you can say, "Not only that, I heard the part that wasn't on Seattle's Morning News." So my advice is to subscribe. And then when we talk to an author, a politician, an entrepreneur, an artist, a scientist, a teacher, a journalist, a celebrity, you'll hear every word. I'm Dave Ross. Thanks for tuning in.